Hello and welcome everyone to this session, which we will be looking at practical steps that departments can take to make their data easier to use. My name is Amrita Devaya and I'm the Deputy Director for Civil Service Communications and Cabinet Office Internal Communications and Engagement, and it is my pleasure to be here with you all today. Set out a little bit of a scene as to what we will be talking about in this session. So across government, we collect huge amounts of data, but often that data and that information is not accessible to those who are using it to make policy. So we're going to look at the steps that we can practically take to store data in a way that makes it easier for the civil service and civil servants to use. There will be open Q&A, so please do think of your questions. But I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel who are joining us here today. I've got Jenny Brooker, who is the Chief Data Architect at the Central Digital and Data Office. Charles Baird, who is the Chief Data Architect at the Office for National Statistics. Malkiat Thairai, who is the Data Protection Officer and Head of Corporate Information Management at Birmingham City Council, and Matt Jennings, who is the Senior Vice President of Global Sales and Strategic Partnerships at Iron Mountain, our knowledge partner. So I'm going to start with a few prepared questions and then we'll come to you as the audience. So Jenny, starting with you. Can you tell us a bit about the CDDO-led initiatives that we have that are helping departments across government share and store their data more efficiently to make it easier for policymakers to access?
Well, I'll start just a bit, not with an assumption that everybody knows what the CDDO is. I did not know it existed until I arrived here about 18 months ago. So Central Digital Data Office, our aim is to improve the use of data across government. And that is through a number of different things. So we write guidance, we can write policies that some of you might have to implement in your organisations. We change legislation sometimes to support better use of data. And we also provide digital services to develop those. The key part that we found, particularly over the last kind of 18 months, is looking at the biggest problems of data sharing across government, where actually, when you want to find data in the first place in order to share it, where do you look? Often it's about kind of the people you know, the networks you have. It might be through today, you might go, oh, great, I had this conversation with somebody and they could really solve my problems because they happen to have that data as well. And also, when you've had that conversation, then there's a whole load of pain around creating those data sharing agreements between organisations, working out, can we actually share this? Do we have a kind of route to do that? And then finally, when you've got through all of that red tape, and then you want to actually look at sharing it with each other, the technical mechanisms to do that, actually that's really hard. So one of the things we've been developing is called the Data Marketplace. And that's a digital service that allows discovery of what we call essential shared data assets. And that's a policy we've developed that says all of your organisations should adopt a really good data ownership practice so that you are looking after your data as assets. And then you should have a think about those data sets that should be shareable, that have value across government. And then we are providing a catalogue of all of those so that you can discover them. And then a guided workflow to help with setting up those data sharing agreements, asking all the right questions up front for you to work through so that you can help those organisations you're asking understand levels of risk and hopefully cut down that really lengthy process, which can be up to 18 months. And we've also updated our API guidance recently as well to help organisations who are sharing their data via APIs to do it in a useful way.
Great, thank you so much. Malkia, I'm going to come to you next, if I may. Can you tell us a little bit about Birmingham's data strategy and how this is helping to improve the way that data is managed and accessed for you guys?
So I think there's probably three core aspects of the policy. The first is around sort of data governance and mastery, and that's about actually understanding what data we have, where it sits, why we have it, why we've kept it for as long as we've kept it, etc., etc. But it's not just about, the kind of the metadata. It's actually understanding the transactional and the attributes of the data behind it. So that, if you're looking at a business process or any kind of council-led process, you can start to see how the data flows from inception through to, delivery of a service or, whatever it is we're doing. So that's one bit, and that's actually trying to get into the nitty-gritty of the data. I think the second bit is very much about, we have something in the region of 450 applications, all which contain data for all the different services that we deliver. So we're trying to create a secondary pool of data, which is not going to the primary source, but creating the secondary source. So that's, in effect, becomes the well that people will go to try and gain access to data. And the third bit, I think, is the people bit, which is kind of picks up on your point, which is trying to get. So before we even get to things like data sharing agreements or data processing agreement, trying to get somebody to sit down and properly articulate what it is that they're actually trying to do. Why do they think they want the data? Why do they think the data is going to help them achieve their objective or their goal or whatever? So to start to understand their intent behind the data sharing. Now, it could be two-way, but it could be one-way. That's not the issue. The issue is trying to get people to articulate that properly, because then the actual task of writing a data sharing agreement becomes that much more simpler, because it's being driven by a clearly articulated objective.
Amazing, thank you. Matt, I'm going to come to you next. You work across government here and abroad. So can you tell us a bit about what is working well? What are the common data challenges facing public bodies across the world? And is there any best practice from abroad that we could learn from over here?
We get brought into a lot of e-government type of initiatives. If you think about government, traditionally there was a lot of paper historically that either we store on behalf of the agencies or that they store. And so there's a discussion on what data sources do they need to go drive an initiative. We get brought into a lot of e-government type of initiatives, and it's a matter of understanding the data sources and what it tells us. As an example, we were meeting with a customer yesterday. Their data goes all the way back to the 1700s. And so what would that data tell us? But you also need to be sensitive about the confidentiality of that data. Healthcare data is handled differently than financial data. There might be some regulatory compliance from a legal perspective. And so we ask a very similar question about what are they trying to accomplish with the data? And that helps them kind of blend what we call the content continuum, which is from the physical data that exists that we can digitize to the digital side, and bring those two elements together in a way that's secure, that has high quality, high value. There's usually a diversity of formats that need to come to that. So we take the complex of both the physical and the digital and bring that to the, for example, e-government applications.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, 1700s, I can only imagine how much data you're dealing with there. And finally, and by no means least, Charles, can you tell us a bit about what the Office of National Statistics is doing to help with better data sharing and storage and integration across government?
Give that a go. Obviously, there's a few things to cover here. One is that the ONS is one of the biggest data consumers across government. So we're often looking to find better ways to bring data in a way that we can use immediately without having to do lots of transformation on it. To that end, we often work very closely with the CDDO and the Data Standards Authority to try and develop new standards for government, or possibly even just get the existing data standards used more widely. There's a big kind of outreach program, a lot of partnership with departments to try to standardize the data that's coming in, to understand it, to get good metadata come across. So we also work very closely in the development of the government metadata standard. But that's probably, to be honest, mostly to benefit us. We want to be able to use the data to produce better statistics, to do better analysis about what government is doing, about what the state of the nation is. From a cross-government perspective, there are probably two things that we're doing at the moment that are most interesting. One, or maybe just most interesting to me, but we'll see how it goes. One is the Integrated Data Service. So that's a cross-government data platform for analysis that we are the lead delivery partner for. So the idea of the integrated data service is to bring together standardized and interoperable data sets from all across government that analysts can use to drive policy decisions, to think about asking new and interesting questions. And the big pitch of the IDS, if you like, is first that it's a trusted research environment. So we're able to demonstrate that it's secure, that there's no re-identification risk on the data that's held in there, and that gives us the ability to bring in high-value data sets from across government for use in a very constrained way. So just for clarity, it's not supposed to be the data platform for government, it's a data platform for the most sensitive data. But the things that we've put in place to enable that mean that we can bring in some data from partner organisations across government that is of great value for policy initiatives. Lots to get into about the IDS, and I appreciate that you shouldn't spend more than about 90 seconds on this, so we won't go into any further detail. But the other thing I wanted to talk about was something that my team specifically delivers, which is something we call the Reference Data Management Framework. And effectively what that is a way to do indexing of data for analytic use. And again, bearing in mind the 90-second rule, I'm not going to get into the detail of how that works, but the big pitch here is that in a situation where one of the big blockers to data sharing across government is the sharing of personally identifiable data across organisational boundaries. This is a technology that allows you to strip that out before it gets shared, but still retain analytic value. So it's the integrated part of the integrated data service, if you like.
Fantastic. Thank you all, and lots to think on and lots of information shared there. Do we have any questions from the audience at all? Oh, we've got one over there, please, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine Williamson, Department for Transport. With data growing exponentially and more desire to share data and platforms to do so, how do we make sure we do this in a sustainable way and don't just keep taking clones of data sets and duplicating them across various parts of government and into the public and private sector as well?
Go for it, Jenny.
Can I start on that one? I think there's a load of different things, but the one I point to at the moment that is, I guess, quite popular in terms of the way we think about data is to start to think about data more as something that we have and that other people would kind of value, and then start to think about that kind of product idea of providing data to others, and how do we then start to package that up. Because I think at the moment, the way in which data is thought about in organisations is like this byproduct of, I've got this operational thing that I do, and it just so happens there's a load of data because I do that. And it's driving my operational thing, and I'm very happy with that. But actually, what I'm not really thinking about is when it has value to others, I have to think differently about like how I make that available. It's not just, here you go, here's a big blob of stuff, enjoy. Actually, I think we need to start thinking about, like, what is it that we need to share between us? Is it just the answer to a question? And we see some of that in things like in the eligibility checks for prescriptions. That's the answer to a question. If we had to move all of that data in order to answer that question, you're right, all of that then starts kind of perpetuating. So I think it starts with really good data management. It starts with ownership in organisations, really starting to think about those assets, and then starting to think of this as a product and starting to think about what does the end user actually want. But that has a whole host of barriers.
Yeah, please do, yeah.
So I think it's a brilliant question, and it is, I couldn't agree more with the product approach in terms of making individual data sets available for certain uses. I think there's two things. One is that on that transactional can you answer a question thing, I think there's been a lot of really great work coming out of CDO about doing this via API. So if it is as simple as, can I get a national insurance number or something, how do you use the API from DWP to do that, rather than what happens occasionally, not as much as it used to, but that you do batch shift huge numbers of records across so you can check across it. But my focus is a little bit more analytical, and historically that is, you take a big dump out of an operational system and you put it somewhere for analysts to ask questions of it. And I think the product's approach starts to to give us an interesting way of not doing that anymore. But I also think the logical follow-through is to do proper federation. So you produce the data product and then you make it available in a standardized way. And it's one of the visions for the IDS that we stop being... is there anyone here from ONS Comms? No? Excellent. So it's it is a data warehouse in that sense. It is bring it in, structure it, put it in a certain way, and I built that. And I'm sure that's not that controversial to ONS Comms, but we'd see. What we'd like to get to a stage is we tell you how to structure the data, we give you tools to check that it's structured in that way, and then you make it available through an interface that we can just query it where it lives. So completely to try and turn that model on its head.
I imagine there's a huge, sorry, I'm coming from my own ignorant perspective, but I imagine there's a huge education piece that needs to happen as well across the civil service, beyond just actually the practicalities and of the implementation. Go on, sorry, go, Nick.
I was going to say, and the incentives as well.
Yeah.
There's no incentive for any organisation to share their data because they don't get any benefit from it. Like, why would you spend all of your time doing things so that it's great for others? And often, when even internally in your organisation, you don't have access to the data when you need it to make your own decisions as well. So I think there's something about the kind of maturity of organisations as well. And as we become more data mature organisations, then actually those incentives can change.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? At the back there, and then over here. Thank you.
This is a more direct question around the DDAT integrated data space. If you were to rank in, say, top 3 issues, what would you say the most major issues were in building that integrated data space?
I can only get 3. Well, the one we talk about, the one I think about most, and actually it's ironic here because I don't know if anyone saw it, but there was a meme on social media yesterday where it was like the worst bit of corporate slang is the building the aeroplane while you're flying it analogy. Like, everyone hates that, right? But that is the problem we're in, where there is no equivalent to a cloud-based, browser-accessed, trusted research environment where we are able to secure access to and audit use of the data. So that is not a product you can buy, or even a way that you can turn existing off-the-shelf products into. It's something we've had to work out as we went on, and it's we've done it. It exists, and you can use it, but it has meant that we've had to make trade-offs around the user experience in terms of what analysts can use as tools in terms of accessing the data. There's been some. So I think probably the first one I'd say is trade-offs in terms of how we were able to build it. The second one, and let me try and put this around the incentives question rather than sounding bitter about how difficult it is to get data out of government departments, because it is rightly really difficult to get data out of government departments because they have a duty of care and a responsibility to protect the data. So a lot of, luckily not mine, but a colleague of mine's job is about signing data sharing agreements with departments and working out how we can demonstrate that the platform is safe and secure and that it will be used in appropriate ways. So I think that reassurance piece is probably number 2. But then I'm a data architect, so I would bang the drum for metadata as the third problem, where from my perspective, because part of my job is understanding the data. Well, I say my job. I've got a team to do this, luckily, because that would go badly otherwise. But part of my job is designing the data that we use on the platform, bringing it in and making it understandable to an analyst who doesn't have an understanding of that data set. A lot of data analysis relies on you understanding the detail of this particular data set that you're looking at, and we have to make that available via metadata. And what has become apparent over the last few years is that, I don't think humanity is particularly good at storing data with good metadata. It's not a government problem. It's none of us are particularly good at doing this. But the number of kind of mature organisations who have good, up-to-date data catalogues and can provide detailed metadata about data sets is vanishingly small. So that's been a third I could go on, but I'll probably stop.
I'd be interested though, because that feels like a whole set of problems that anyone who is trying to do this would face. I mean, like, does that kind of chime as well in terms of marking out your work?
Yeah, I mean, just trying to understand what the data is, where it sits, what it means, and how it changes. So, if you take any piece of legislation, a new piece of regulation that comes out, it changes the business process. If you're looking at housing, education, adult social care, you change the thresholds, you change the type of data that you might be accessing and how it's being judged and assessed in order to get the service or back to the person, or you tell them, you're not eligible for whatever reason. So understanding those sort of nuances as regulation comes out, so what was the business process before, what was the data collection before, and how is it changed by that regulation, and what's the impact. You need time to kind of assess and that level of detail, because that's where the intelligence comes from to say, well, actually, was it a good policy or a bad policy, or a good policy badly implemented? Yeah, so it's there's that level of detail that you need to go into, and it takes effort and time. Sadly, it's one of the things we don't sort of think about very much.
No, thank you. I think we've got another question over here.
Hi there. Yeah. So just from a unstructured data perspective and trying to get it into a structured sort of environment, what do you think is the biggest challenge of actually doing that with regards to the sheer drive capacity of the environment that you're working in, but also what would it mean to the public sector in general to be able to extrapolate that and move it into an environment from a methodology perspective?
Who's gone, Matt?
He's from Iron Mountain, so I think he's asking the panelists here.
I'll go first on that one.
Yeah, go for it.
Because literally I have a conversation about structured and unstructured data yesterday in the office. But I think I'd question a certain point about the need to turn all unstructured data into structured data, because not all of it is necessary or valuable. As I said in the first question, I think one of the biggest challenges is the people issue. So people using unstructured data as a way of managing their work, as opposed to using the line of business systems to manage their work. So there's an overhead attached to managing that, and I think as the first delegate talked about, the exponential growth of data, because people have that level of freedom to do exactly that, that's one of the biggest challenges around structured and unstructured data. For me, we're on a push to kind of say, well, if it's not in a line of business system or it's not structured, then it's going to go, and that takes you on to another huge cultural challenge in local government and probably civil service and probably the private sector. Is anybody is loath to get rid of any data that they possess. It's just, yeah.
We talk a bit in our kind of knowledge and information records management teams about the digital heap and how things like AI can help and support us starting to actually get some value out of it. But it is the kind of recognition that it's people, creating documents, creating things, and then there's nothing to tell you, the context of why they created it and like how long should this information be useful for. And I think those are the things that the structured data can then help you. So I think there's something about the balance between like all of the structured data that is there and then that it is meant to make sense, helping you to actually then kind of tackle those big lots of unstructured data. But I think there is still value in all of that, because you look at what Department for Education are trying to do at the moment in terms of creating an educational content store to support AI. Really interesting and great project. How do you kind of create all of the national curriculum? But then, what's the next step after that is what about all the kind of kids' drawings and obviously they own the intellectual property on those, but what is the kind of next step and the next step to drive some of the really good outcomes that they're looking for, like better education and targeting the right areas and including the right things. So I think there can be really good value in that, but it does start with that big digital heap.
I had a couple of things, but now I'm really worried about the intellectual property of my children's drawings, and also that they find out what my data retention policy is on them. So the first one I think is a bit depressing in the sense that I think it is all about filtering, because there is that notion of the digital heap, and it can't all be valuable, right? And it has for the last few years it's been, oh, there must be loads of value in that. I keep getting told, and yet we never really find it. And so I often think about, because I'm a data architect, I often think about semantic layers, because I guess it's just a sickness. But the idea of a semantic layer is hard enough for structured data where you can get good metadata. And the idea of a semantic layer for unstructured data is something I think we will have to explore through things like GenAI, where it is mostly about text processing. And I just don't know, I guess my negative thing on this is I just don't know if we'll ever be able to put enough context around it to be able to get real value out of it. So it might be one of those things where the ROI just isn't good enough. But I think the positive thing I would say is that, or maybe it's not that positive thinking about it, but one thing that I've experienced not just in civil service but in enterprise over a number of years is that organisations are really bad at institutional memory, and it is partly that thing about, yes, we do save everything, but nobody ever reads it again. And half of the meetings I go to are things that really could have been avoided if people had done the reading in advance. And so I don't know if there is a way, and it's one of the experiments we've got going in our data science campus, using GenAI to do effective document summarization and publication, if you like, within teams to try and address that. Because I think we're obviously not going to solve the problem of institutional memory if we rely on corporate practices. So what can we do from a technical perspective to support that?
I think there's a really interesting question there around how you take all that data that we have and make it, I guess the topic of this conversation, make it accessible for policymakers, but then also if you layer AI and technological advances on top of that, how do you actually make sure that you are using that data correctly and making it accessible in the same way? I don't know the answer. But, oh. Did you? There's a question just here at the front, please.
Thank you. I have a real interest in data quality, and in terms of looking at the subject line there, data validation is something I'd really like you guys to elaborate on a little bit more. Be that spreadsheets that departments use, or be that the systems that we build that we put data validation rules on, or fail to, for that matter. And some of the behaviors which we actually then subsequently see. So, you might make a field a mandatory value, but if you don't have the process and the people behind that, you end up with people choosing the first value in the list, and it represents poor quality data. So have you got any guidance for how we might approach data validation, introducing data validation in our services?
Go first,
Matt. I was tempted to just glibly say, yeah, we've solved that, and then leave it, because we absolutely haven't. I think there's two things. One is there are some things we can do from a technical perspective. So we do a lot of profiling as data comes in, and provided we get the right metadata with it, we can check the data against the metadata, and you can start to put some basic rules in to do exactly the things you talk about. And that is very useful until you say, yeah, that's not good enough, and then someone says, do you then remediate it yourself? And we've got a team of people who do that, but a lot of the time it's best guess rather than anything we can rely on. Or do you send it back to the supplier and say, we don't? It sort of depends on the urgency of the supply request, right? Whether or not you do that. So there is there's a fundamental, and it comes back to my point about people not storing metadata very well, not really storing data that well in a consistent way, that it's quite hard we can say, yes, we do all this profiling validation, but then the obvious next question is, and then what? Because most things fail. And I don't necessarily have a good answer for that other than it's remediation or it's pushing those checks further up the stack. So you're doing it at the moment of collection rather than at the moment of use. But the other thing I would talk about, because ONS runs the government data quality hub, and I think it is worth keeping in mind the various distinctions about the various dimensions of data quality. So it can be, is this the wrong value in a field that's supposed to be is, or it can be, this data set doesn't include, during 94 we did not collect data for Essex in this nationwide survey, right? Yeah. So one of the things that the architects in my team often shout at me about is that I say, can't we try and find a way of standardizing that? And I think the answer is not always, because sometimes it's a narrative thing. Right? So I think there's the, as you rightly point out, that validation piece around the technical ask, but there's also how do you get to a more coherent understanding of what flaws might be inherent in data, and that you can still use it, but you just have to adjust your analysis for.
Yeah, very similar for us. If you think about the data that we create, there's some tools that we can use from an AI perspective to validate that, but the exceptions sometimes need to get handled by a human in the loop, to verify what's happening there. The tools can be upgraded from that knowledge that's created from that, but it's a continual challenge going forward.
Malkia.
I mean, my experience, I suppose, is whenever I get asked questions about, what can we do about data quality, it's just a rabbit hole to go down, because if you're trying to fix it after the event, you will never get anywhere. So part of it is how much can you force through, your business processes or the technology. When we're looking at, or when I'm working with my colleagues to kind of look at data, kind of try and focus away from data quality and talk about how rich is the data that you've got. So rather than plug the gaps, is there enough in the data that you've got? Yeah, exactly, because you don't need, an entry in every single field or the attribute. Yeah, and
yes,
but I think part of the mindset is that people have that it's got to be absolutely perfect, and it's not, and that's why you kind of try and move away from this notion of, there's a standard generic approach to data quality across every line of business system, every application, every service, every business process, and kind of look at it from the point of how rich is it, so is it personally identifiable data that's going to be richer? If we're getting data about missed bins, how important is that really in the scheme of things?
Can I give a big plug in terms of, that kind of practicalities which we were kind of talking about today? So our teams are working on updates to the data quality framework, and that means that it makes organisations create a data quality action plan, because I think the thing that is a lot in terms of missing from that is actually having any understanding of what the quality is. I've been in organisations so often where senior people are just like, oh, well, we can't do anything because our data quality is terrible. And you're like, okay, well, what is it? They're like, don't know, it's just rubbish. And there's no understanding then of, well, how good does it need to be? How much do we need to invest? Is it like 10 minutes of somebody's time that we just haven't done? Or is it like 10,000 hours? And so for me, the first bit is just understanding where your data's at. And that validation side is much about, like, where did it come from and what happened? But again, I think this is where technology can help as well, because you've got AI that can start to learn about what should your data be looking like. If you had customer sales from 500 shops, and all of a sudden you've got 500 less rows, did one of your shops close on that day? Is that? But again, it goes back to, it's probably a person that ends up remediating those big things. But actually just understanding it and flagging it is probably the first step, really.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Oh, he's got another one at the front.
I wanted to pick up on something someone mentioned about sustainability earlier, and AI potentially has the solution to the big problems like clean energy, but it's creating those problems for us at the same time. And I work in HMRC, and the duplication of data, large data sets that we see there, reference data being purchased multiple times by multiple government organizations, gazetteers, address gazetteers, that sort of thing. There's a lot of efficiency that we could find, I think. But then going to your point about semantic layers, and perhaps I'm wondering if you guys could elaborate a little bit on technologies such as in-memory usage, where we can federate data from highly normalized stores, which are much lower footprint in terms of their storage and compute cost, but then are actually still useful for analysts who aren't computer scientists. And there's a sort of a distinction in terms of the discipline of efficiently storing data and actually deriving insight from it. I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yes, Charles?
I
Did
mean,
you?
yeah, I guess is the answer. So a couple of things. One is your first point about what's commonly understood by sustainability, right? So how can we lower the energy use of some of this? And it absolutely comes back to that very good point about duplication. That at a certain point, well, I'm sure that at least 2 of my regular correspondents have got a thing at the end of their email that says it costs, or it's a kilo of carbon dioxide to store this email for a year. Please think about whether you're keeping it. And I was like, well, I'll immediately delete it then. But to get to that point of normalization, you do have the problem that you're creating big data stores, right? And that is, innately energy intensive, and it gets worse when you put the compute that Gen AI puts on it. And we do things. So we've got some approaches to this which are only use it when there is a demonstrable ROI on it. So you could say we've got, for instance, and I'm going to say this in the next session, so I won't give spoilers, but we've got a system or 2 systems that do classifications against reference data. So standard industrial codes, SIT codes, or standard occupation codes, that a lot of data sets need to be indexed against for analytic use. And we've developed over a number of years a machine learning approach to this, which uses natural language processing to do bulk matching of this at scale to a relatively good accuracy. And I'm going to say 70%, and that doesn't sound great, but in a classification matching thing, it's actually brilliant, take my word for it. And we've recently developed a Gen AI approach which gets you to 75%. Right? And so we've had to put in quite an interesting workflow where you make a decision early on whether or not the 300% more expensive and more energy intensive use of Gen AI is useful for that 5%. And there are times when it is. Right? So there are times when you're producing national statistics when we will take that cost and we'll do it. But there are times when we're doing analysis that doesn't need the same rigor, where we fail off to the slightly less accurate thing. So there are some practical steps you can do if you can get some decent numbers about pricing and consumption, but those aren't always available.
Yeah, I was going to say, the piece I'll add is that question in particular is what led to our data center creation at Iron Mountain and being very intentional about having a sustainable data center. And so part of that discussion is when we create this data or add additional data to our environments, we're asked, can you store that for us as well? Can you host that? So they can take advantage of the sustainable environment that we have. And then we build the integration components into the back-end systems that adheres to information governance and policy compliance, regulatory compliance, and those types of things. So there is some, delivery we have with sustainability in our data centers by creating that data.
Jenny?
Well, I think there's a wind back moment as well, isn't there? In order for us to do really good data sharing, by the time all of this data kind of reaches you and you kind of pull it from all these different sources, how many different computes are you doing to actually transform your data? That's huge, because you're running those pipelines. It could be every minute, it could be once a day. You could be, you're doing all of those things to actually join it all together and make it really usable for the analysts. Wouldn't it be great if we all started adopting standards in how we store our data, and when we start to share it, adhering to those standards, so that actually the data just becomes more interoperable? So I think there's a role for just standardizing our data that would really help in terms of the amount of compute we have to create all of those mega data pipelines.
Sorry, just to
No.
speak twice, why don't you? But there's a good thing about your data products thing is a perfect example of a good approach to this, where you'd say, part of the problem is that we often say, just give me all the data and I will ask the questions of it. I say we, analysts as a notional we, say, just give us all the data and we'll make use of it. Where if you say, actually, what is the question you're trying to answer, and we can more deliberately give you a product which answers that rather than, because it does end up with loads more compute, loads more use.
That seems to be the crux of most of it, is like, what are you doing with the data? And actually then building the framework around how you share and use that better. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, over there at the back. And then another one on the other side.
Thank you. The sustainability part is very interesting, especially in view that I'm joining the net zero department soon. We talked about sustainability at DFE as well, and the fact that there are so many discs spinning somewhere in Iceland drying lakes is very much on our agenda. Jokes apart, we talked about data governance before, and data governance includes archiving data in a sustainable format as well. So not all data needs to be kept hot and accessible all the time. There is a certain retention period when it should be, by all means. And after that retention period is nearing expiration, that data should be compacted and stored in a cheaper format, I would imagine. Would you agree?
Do you know what? Somebody asked me a question the other day of, they have 20 years worth of data, and the first 5 years have loads of information, and then it kind of tails off. How could they get all of the same levels of information into the first one as the kind of last 5 years in order that they can kind of run their machine learning model that they've created? And the answer was, like, don't do it. Like that level of thought process of, I've created this data for the last 5 years. I've got a really good answer that fits with my business question. Now I want to, do exactly the same thing for 15 years ago. Actually, the questions are completely different, and the way in which you approach it is different. And so I think people are worried about getting rid of some of their data because of they see the kind of value to the data science teams. But often they don't think about, actually, maybe I only need to save these pieces of information. And so I think there's a nuance to that retention that is really understanding which are the valuable bits that I genuinely would like to keep for that kind of longevity. Because we do see those questions coming up in retention, and you do see data science teams going, no, keep it all. We love data, like just keep giving us all of it. But I think then there's that kind of challenge back to go, can you really have a think about which bits would be valuable?
It's really interesting. I think there's also a fear element as well, particularly with teams who are not data scientists. Like, if we delete it, what will happen? Like, best keep it, which is a thing. Sorry, Malkia, and then Charles.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, just picking up on that, I mean, one of the big challenges, as I said earlier, is trying to get people to get rid of stuff that they don't need, they don't value. There's no technology fit as part of our strategy. It's gone beyond its legal retention period. You're just holding on to it for no purpose or no value. So trying to get rid of data is exactly that. And I find when you're looking at the data sharing, you're looking at some of these questions. Again, it goes back to my earlier point about trying to get people to articulate what they're actually doing. If they want to do historical research, that's one thing. But if they're looking at data to inform future policy development, do you really need to go back 5, 7, 15, 25 years in order to set policy for the next 3 years? It's trying to get them to think about, what's the bit they're actually trying to address. So, and I think the 2 points about sustainability are well made, because if that starts to feature in your decisions about your technology roadmaps to say what's sustainable, what's your environmental footprint, what your carbon footprint in some of these issues, then you'll have it'll be a more rounded conversation about actually the data and its retention and its reuse.
Yeah, huge education piece there as well.
Yeah.
Matt, I think you wanted to come in.
Nope.
No, you didn't. Then,
Nope.
Nope.
I'll skip it. It was just a glib anecdote.
Question there, and then another one on the other side, please.
Hi, yeah, I'm Chris Allen from the Government Office for Tech Transfer. So we're very concerned about sort of knowledge assets and data as an asset. And it struck me that government is a lot more mature about valuing assets when it comes to estates, a lot more mature when it comes to actual finance. What would be really nice if you could put a dollar value on a database, if you could calculate the yield, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of steps to go between where we are and where we might be if we were to be as mature as those kind of services. So just any clues as to the steps we've still got to take and what they will look like? I mean, I think the reference to having a chief data officer sounds like a really positive step, but there's obviously some other ones as well that we'd like to see.
Oh.
Can I take it from just, I guess, to understand your question? So there is value to our data within government. So that could be building better citizen-facing services. That could be improving the measurement of policy, a whole host of kind of benefits. Then when we look at, okay, making that data also available more widely into the economy and to others, I think you get into the whole discussions about open data. So we have a massive amount of value that is still derived from our open data, even, what are we now, 10 years on? Even maybe more. And I think data is always really hard to justify the value of. I think everyone here is in a data team, like justifying, like working out the metrics of the kind of dashboards you've created and like how they've driven benefit across your own organizations. Like it's really hard, like scaling that up to what's the value of our data to the economy and to economic growth and to organizations, and therefore do we need to charge? Should we be making it available more openly to drive innovation, to drive all those kind of things? I think all of those questions are the ones we need to answer. So I think that is something we need to understand, particularly in the age of huge guzzling things like data guzzlers like AI.
I think there's the topic of data valuation is a hot one, right? And you often get asked about it, and I get this blank look on my face because I honestly don't know how you'd go about it for all those reasons. I mean, just even if you leave aside what is the value of being able to ask a direct question about whether or not someone is eligible for benefits, which is a data transfer, or is on certain registers, which is another direct data transfer. You could probably put a dollar sign on that. How would you put a dollar sign on? We made this data available, which allowed you to do some analysis, which drove a policy change, which resulted in X improvement to GDP, right? How do you start to? So I find it a really tricky one, and I find that there are a couple of organizations who have done data valuation things, and what I find is that they always come out with really suspiciously round and large numbers, right? It's very valuable and it's very important, and that's how you should treat it. And I don't disagree, I just find the numbers a little bit unconvincing.
Yeah, from our perspective, there's a lot of discussion on just the efficiency of the data that we put together. And so making that available to the citizens, less paper, more engagement directly. There's some e-government type of wallets, which has your health data, it has your passport information, it might have your birth records. Like those types of things, making those available is more of an efficiency gain, which are the conversations that we have with some of the e-government customers that we're working with.
No, and I think that's a constant issue, isn't it? How do you make government services more accessible to the public? Malkia, did you have something you want to add there?
I mean, in terms of how do you add a value to it? I mean, as I said, I'm from Birmingham. If you know anything about Birmingham, we're a bit cash strapped at the moment. So we're looking at every single penny and kind of looking at cost optimizations left, right, and centre, and trying to, and the challenge is exactly what you're saying, which is we know how much the technology costs, we know what the contract costs are, we know what the staffing costs are, but how do we justify keeping those systems in place, because we understand that actually the delivery of the service, the more efficient the service can be delivered, et cetera, et cetera. So some of those non-tangible costs, how do we articulate those, are the challenges that we're facing right now, because people can see, you know, the pounds and pennies, but they can't see the added value, and there's no way, you know, as has been said, you know, what represents a good value? You know, is it, you know, a 0.5% ROI, or does it have to be 15 or 20 or something like that? So it's a really challenging space to be in at the moment, to be able to justify IT spend as an investment, as opposed to, you know, just cut it because we've got financial challenges.
Yeah. No, thank you all ever so much. We are actually out of time. That was probably the quickest 50 minutes I've sat through, and I've learnt a hell of a lot, because I think, unlike most of you, I don't sit in a data team. But what I have taken away from this is that we should all be asking ourselves, what are you doing with the data? What do you need the data for? And that should be front and centre of our decision making. We should be thinking about data as a product, and what we have and how we are sharing that as well. And then also sustainability, and thinking about what we are doing to make sure that the data that we keep and the data that we don't keep, and how we are being more sustainable with that as well. So hopefully I've summarised that into 3 useful things. But thank you all so much for joining, and thank you to our brilliant panellists. Thank you.
Thank you.